Hello, this is Mike Swanson, and you're listening to the Wall Street Window podcast. I'm going to play for you in a few moments an interview I did last week on the Ochelli Effect. Before I play that, I want to tell you, if you go to the Wall Street Window website and follow what I put out on my email list, you'll notice about 50% of the information is about the financial markets and investing, a lot of which is about gold, silver, and the mining stocks, because I believe those are the best places to make money, not just the next couple months, but for the next couple years. But if you pay close attention, you'll also see that there'll be blog posts about other topics. There may be news events going on, geopolitical events, and on the email list, I typically every single morning put out a list of the top stories impacting the markets and really the news cycle that are worth paying attention to. But all this reflects the fact that I have lots of interest. Before I got into the financial markets, I actually was in a PhD program for history. I got a master's degree and dropped out of that and got into the financial world. But about 10 years ago, I wrote a book called The War State, subtitled The Cold War Origins of the Military-Industrial Complex and the Power Elite. The reality is today, when you factor in the interest on the national debt from past wars and total defense expenditures, the United States spends almost 40% of its entire budget on defense spending, even though we're not in the situation where we were over 10 years ago fighting so heavily in Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time. But all this accounts for almost half of total arms spending, and it's having a big impact on the size of the U.S. budget deficit. My book, The War State, is about the beginning of all this and why it came into being and why it was different from the history of the United States before World War II. And what I talked about last week with Chuch Ochelli is a book I'm currently working on about the Vietnam War. And so this discussion is sort of a preview of some of my thoughts about that topic and angles I'm taking in my research that are different than the way most people characterize the war. But this discussion began when he asked me about the year 1968 and the Tet Offensive. So let's get on to that and play that interview.
Get ready for the Ochelli Effect.
I'm a big fan of the show.
Chuch Ochelli, and he's been known for many years as a blind PFK researcher specializing in intelligence agency involvement in multiple assassination, propaganda, and other global criminal operations in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Your listeners are extremely fortunate to have you.
And now, the most underrated voice in all media.
Chuch Ochelli!
12th day of November 2019, allegedly, according to that thing we call a calendar, and this is the Ochelli Effect. So, what are we looking at today on a Tuesday? We have Mike Swanson with us in the first hour, Pierce Redmond with us in the second hour, and it's going to be an interesting show, I'm sure, because the world around us continues to be rather fascinating, at least until tomorrow, when it'll seem like everything else in the world stops, and now we're going to watch impeachment, guaranteed, brothers and sisters. I'll be up at 8 a.m. watching the opening ceremonies of the stupid Olympics up there on Capitol Hill. But meanwhile, what do we have going on? Well, Jimmy Carter has apparently survived through surgery despite having pressure on his brain and appears to be recovering. So there's that. There is what's going on in Israel regarding them assassinating somebody, rockets being flown back at them, and now they're conducting airstrikes, I think, as we speak. But anyway, with all of that going on, why does CNN need to hire Rick Santorum to be a talking head when there are lines and lines of Trump apologists around the block looking to get on TV to promote their books? I have no idea. And meanwhile, maybe bribery will be a topic of discussion tomorrow night. Who knows? Anyway, let's get to it. Mike Swanson, the guy behind WallStreetWindow.com. Of course, the individual who wrote the book, The War State, working on a book on Vietnam. I might actually ask him for a personal favor to have a little focus in that book on a particular incident and its ramifications, but who knows if we'll get to that tonight. He also has a podcast, and I haven't been keeping track of what's going on, although I will be soon, because I'm going to do another one of those Wall Street Window podcast digests coming up through the website and all that. And meanwhile, here he is, doing his thing outside of that. He's with us in the first hour, like I said, Pierce Redmond, Porkins Policy Radio, which airs here, although it's on hiatus, and PorkinsPolicyReview.com. All right, so all of that out of the way. Mike, how you doing, man?
Oh, I'm doing good. I was out of town last week. I went up to the Delaware area, Maryland area, visiting relatives. It's kind of funny you mentioned Vietnam. I was actually going to mention something about it because I'm something in a book I'm reading about it. But before I do, what was your incident or event you were interested in?
Well, I focus very heavily on a certain part of the war, which I think, not only the beginning and the ending, right? But in 1968, the Tet Offensive, which took place in January, I believe, and the ramifications afterwards, exactly how that got beaten back and what it did effectively to the war in general, I think is something that is extremely relevant, certainly shaped what was happening regarding the politics of it in the United States. But I am failing to find a lot of places where a real accurate accounting for exactly what went on there and exactly what it took to change the circumstance back to a situation where, yes, indeed, our guys were winning battles all over the place, vacating, killing more enemy soldiers 10-1 at that point in time, and still being demoralized by the fact that they would then abandon the ground they had gained to only have to go back and retake it again. And 1968 is a brutal year in the war, whether people want to understand it or not. It also happens to be the year that my father went, and I find it really remarkable that that's where he landed, is right after the Tet Offensive. A few months later, and what was going on there, it almost makes sense that a lot of damage, a lot of casualties were had. And again, by body count, we were still killing the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese regulars, if you will, and the Viet Cong, which are two different things, apparently. We were allegedly killing them 10-1 and still not winning the war. I think that's something that needs to be examined and broken down by somebody in print in a much better way than it ever has been. And I suggest that you're exactly the guy who could make that relatable to the American public in your book. So that is my suggestion request for you covering the Vietnam War in your book.
Well, it'll be eventually. The book I'm working on, it's going to end in 1963. When Kennedy's killed. It's going to be like twice as long as the first book I wrote. But my plan is to basically write 3 books. That one would be part 1. Part 2 will be one only about 1964, about Vietnam, the Warren Commission, and the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And then after that, there would be one that would cover from then on to the period you're talking about. But the thing is you commented, your father went over there in 1968, and that's most Americans that served over there went over there in 1967 or 1968. By then in 1965, there were about 150,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. 1964, it was 24,000. But 65 is when they sent the first divisions to fight, basically. And then in 67, the situation turned worse for the United States and the South Vietnamese. And we had to send more people over there. And, of course, it exploded in 68 with the Tet Offensive. But that offensive, the first part of it was in January and February, and it, of course, led to LBJ's resignation in April. But there was a second offensive that was a part of that called the Mini Tet, which took place from May to August. So it kind of went on almost the entire year, basically. And yes, it was a defeat, a military defeat for the North Vietnamese. They were planning that a mass offensive all at once, which is what they launched, and they weren't supposed to be able to do that if you went by the talking points LBJ and the General Westmoreland and others were giving, that, you know, that we were turning the corner, things would eventually get better, and so forth. Obviously, that was all proven false. But through sheer firepower, what didn't happen was the North Vietnamese, they were expecting a mass uprising with South Vietnamese people. The Viet Cong basically would multiply and spread, and they would, you know, kind of have a knockout win, so to speak. And that didn't happen. And so for them, it was a military defeat, and they lost, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but many people. I mean, probably, I'll turn and look as we're doing this real quick, close to 100,000.
Well, let me give a little bit of the connective.
Over 100,000 during the course of that year.
Yeah.
So, well, one thing before you go,
Sure.
or before you say something, I should say, is that one result of this is that for the North Vietnamese, they lost a good number of men. The Viet Cong really got diminished, but the thing about the North Vietnamese, throughout the entire war, they were able to quickly replenish their losses.
Right.
And that's really in the end why they won. It's sort of like during World War II, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, he defeated them in the first couple months, and in the United States, the Army intelligence was analyzing the battles that were taking place when Hitler invaded the Soviets, and they thought Hitler was going to win until they came to the realization that Stalin was taking mass casualties but replenishing the divisions. His divisions weren't going away, and they realized, well, okay, you know, the Soviets are probably going to win here.
Well,
and
right.
that's one of the stories of the Vietnam War. But the North Vietnamese Army in 1968, with the big destruction of the Viet Cong, the people, you know, when you watch these Vietnam War movies, the people in the pajamas, the black pajamas, they really got wiped out, and the North Vietnamese Army really took over that side of the war. And then as the war went on, they just became more and more modernized and so forth.
Well, right. And look, it was a war of attrition. I wanted to give you a minute to go look at things and fill in a few blanks for people that are listening who might not necessarily understand the entirety of what we're talking about. The Tet Offensive, the initial Tet Offensive, was a strike that was organized in advance of the Chinese Lunar New Year, which is generally a time when a cessation of hostilities took place during the Vietnam War. There would be like a ceasefire time period. Now, the Americans figured that this was going to be the way it was in general, but the intelligence corps of the military knew better, actually, and were arguing apparently the entire time that they should be prepared because something was happening. They weren't entirely sure what was happening, but something was. Meanwhile, what we have learned in hindsight is that the Viet Cong were, moving a lot of things along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and putting assets in place, whether it be munitions or it is personnel, whatever. They were hiding this stuff and putting it out there and moving it along as if it was part of regular agricultural movements or commerce or whatever. And they were moving things in place for the Tet Offensive. the military assets which are there to combat the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong at that time were really caught on their heels. And in some cases, various places were overrun, including the headquarters of the General Westmoreland there. In Saigon, I believe it was.
Yeah, he was in Saigon.
There was, but his headquarters was not the only one overrun. There was a simultaneous coordinated attack on over 100 emplacements in the country that were American or American friendly. Many of them destroyed, many of them overrun. The majority of them actually overrun because a whole lot of assets, a whole lot of men were kind of moved to the rear, were sort of not placed in the right position to be able to defend it. And quite frankly, for the remainder of a couple of months afterwards, there had to be efforts to retake not only the headquarters, but some cities like Hue was an incredibly city under siege at the time. All of this took place, and like you said, there was a mini Tet Offensive, but I think nothing startled the military apparatus like the Tet Offensive itself, the initial thing there. And I know that my father got there. My father got there in May. So when he went, they were in the midst of still trying to take back the assets lost. And I say again, a lot of battlefields at this time, the ebb and flow of the war, if you will. They would take areas, they would take hills, they would take villages, and claim them, and then they would be withdrawn from the area. And what would happen is, quite frankly, the enemy would retake the area. And in some cases, there were, units rotating, retaking the same areas that had been taken weeks before, days before. It was like this ridiculousness. And why? Because, yes, indeed, the North Vietnamese continued to replenish their troops faster than we could kill them. That's the reality of it. And I state again, there was something like a 10-to-1 ratio for body counts during this time. The Vietnamese were losing 10, we were losing 1, and still there was no end, seemingly, to the amount of personnel that they could put out there. That, along with the cooperation of certain people, no, there was no direct uprising. That's what the Viet Cong were dependent upon, was the idea that the people would uprise in mass at one particular moment. However, they continued to do so and interfered, and there was various back and forth, and of course, well, now we get into what did the Americans actually do to some of those people that did that, and it gets into a whole very, very dirty part of the story. But the thing is, I think that 1967 into 68 and through 68 tells you everything you need to know about the Vietnam War, because this is why it was an untenable situation for the U.S. military. So that's why I say it. Now, if that's going to be in your third volume, great. Take your time.
Yeah, it take 10 years to get to it.
Maybe but yeah.
Well, 2 points I like to make about it. First of all, one of the as you said, there were some people in Army intelligence that expected something could happen, and they should be prepared for it. And General Westmoreland, he was, and I guess the people around him in Army intelligence, they were worried that there would be a repeat of what happened to the French, in the sense that the Vietnamese would trap a major army, American army, and destroy it, put it under siege and eliminate it. And a battle that looked like that was their plan took place at Khe Sanh, which was put under siege right at the same time as the General Tet Offensive, which is all over the rest of the country, was taking place. So, and this became a big thing that was in the news, and I don't remember how long the siege lasted, probably 30 days or something. But basically is very similar to Dien Bien Phu. These people were trapped on an airstrip and couldn't get out of there for quite some time. But the tragedy or maybe that's not the right word, but one of the signs of futility, I guess, is that, as you mentioned, the North Vietnamese infiltrated all these people throughout the whole country, and in Saigon in particular, the guy that was in charge of the Tet Offensive came down to some general. He came from Laos and went in Saigon and set up his own headquarters, right in the middle of the city. Right. And the CIA had no idea that this was happening. And I found that out, I don't know, sometime in the past 12 months, reading the CIA history, that they had zero intelligence that this Tet Offensive was going to happen, and they only had like one person that, they had an inkling, like some prisoner they took or something, and they just completely dismissed it. Now, the South Vietnamese police, which, is a famous photo during the Tet Offensive where the head of the police shoots a guy in the head. Oh, yeah, that's actually a piece of film which has become an iconic image where he shoots a BC informant, sympathizer, or member, depending on how you... He was the head of... The man in that photo was the head of the South Vietnamese police. Police, right. He was actually a very important person. Now, his police... They were like the secret police too. They would interrogate prisoners and so forth. And they had some evidence that, not definitive, but suggested something was afoot. And the Americans just simply dismissed it. And one reason they did that is they had a view that it's impossible for them to do something this big, and that they would do what they try to do to the French all over again. So, the problem was, the problem as far as I'm reading it is that they were moving these, remember the assets I was talking about, right? Right. Those things were being moved so well among the people that, quite frankly, the CIA didn't know about it. Yeah. And some of the other military intelligence groups didn't know about it, but Army Intel knew. That's what the weird thing is, that Army Intel was sitting there sending memorandums, from what I understand, to people trying to say, something is happening here, and we need to pay attention. And they didn't know the particulars, but they were kind of alarmed. And I've also seen claims, in hindsight, from individuals who were involved in I-Corps that said that, we were trying to tell them that something was very wrong here. Now, the interesting thing is that they thought it was impossible because it would have to be noticeable for them to pull off something this large. Sure. And in a normal way, that would be true if they didn't have the cooperation of a lot of the civilians. Because that's the thing. They were hiding, like guns in, wagons full of rice and things like this in order to put, the bigger guns in place to launch the attacks, like on Westmoreland's, headquarters. That required some heavier guns. And they moved that in literally things of rice over the course of months. Yeah, you're talking about the infiltration of tens of thousands of people and their equipment. Yes. And a lot of civilian cover for it. Yeah. Because it wasn't like, hey, here's a military truck going down the road. Meanwhile, the U.S. is trying to blow up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and this is why there were people out there constantly repairing it. Because, you know what I'm saying? It's like a whole lot of things come to make a lot more sense when we understand what happened here. And I think that it is a microcosm of what went wrong during the entire war. Quite honestly, I mean, after when the 1970s come in, we get to see Nixon try to change the policy and everything else there, and the bombings and the madman strategy, and it does no good because of exactly what we see in 67 and 68. Excuse me. One thing there's some new stuff about this period, the Tet Offensive period, I want to tell you about in a few minutes. Great. But to get to it, there's a key event, there's a history we don't really know about. I put it to you that way. Uh-huh. That's only touched on, only now starting to be discovered. And basically, to give you an example, the Kennedy tapes that had been released the tapes for 1963 have not been transcribed, most of them. And with LBJ, it's the same story. I mean, there's tons of LBJ tapes, but they're just audio. So only now, are some people even getting to them.
Just for the listeners' edification, I want you to know something. There's a lot of that stuff that is available through the LBJ library.
Oh, you can listen to it.
You can listen to, you can order copies of, you can obtain them. But they are not transcribed. You're correct. There's not many transcriptions for a whole lot of audio. The Kennedy Library has done a little bit of a better job organizing it, to be honest with you, but this has been, left to private researchers in the presidential libraries, really, and the presidential libraries just look to preserve it. They didn't necessarily go for transcription. But that's the thing. It's actually there. So, I mean, you as a personal individual out there, if you wanted to, you could obtain those tapes and, do the service of transcribing some interesting pieces of history. Now a lot of it is very mundane and difficult to listen to, especially the telephone calls. You and I have been through some of these tapes. We know they're very noisy,
Sure.
very strange, hard to hear somebody on one line or the other. But they are available. A lot of these recordings are actually available and simply have not been really presented to the public, even though they are available to the public. Am I right or wrong?
Oh, exactly
Okay.
right. And one of the things that's, as a result, there's lots of books about the Vietnam War, and some new ones, all the time, but very few that are using this new information.
Right.
And most of them are written by, and that's what maybe I'll get to it, but most of them are written by soldiers that were over there telling you about their experiences and so forth.
Which, fair enough, but does not allow us to know what the overall picture is regarding. Yeah, exactly.
So the new thing I want to get to is that Robert McNamara is Secretary of Defense, and there's that movie, probably a lot of people have seen it,
The Fog of War.
The Fog of War, exactly, with Errol Morris, and he talks about resigning, or he's not sure. Was he? Did LBJ fire him, or did he resign, or whatever? And some people said he was having a nervous breakdown, and there's actually one of these LBJ tapes. He says to someone he doesn't want McNamara to kill himself, like James Forrestal, who did. He was a Secretary of Defense under Truman,
right?
And died. But so there's this thing about what was really going on with McNamara, because he resigns during this Tet Offensive, in the beginning of it, like on January the 19th. He's succeeded by Clark Clifford. So what really happened, looking at this stuff, I believe, is in 1967. He wasn't like, let me put you this way: the idea that he resigned or was fired by Johnson. If you watch the Fog of War movie, you may come to that you may get the idea that he was pushed out because he turned against Johnson, or became against the war or something like that, and therefore Johnson pushed him out. That's sort of the narrative, and McNamara's book, in retrospect, kind of makes it sound like that too. That he writes several memos to Johnson about the war is unsustainable, and while before he'd been one of the leading proponents of escalating and actually, I believe, pressuring Johnson to do so.
Well, let me interrupt you for a second, because in the year 2000, he did a presentation where he wanted to focus on the concept of mutually assured destructive deterrent.
Right.
And he did this in New York, and I was there. I got to tell you something. He did it for NYU. I don't know. Maybe there's a recording somewhere. Somebody can find it. I've heard there is. But the fact is, I don't know if it preserved all the recordings of people trying to ask questions. a lot of people wanted to ask questions about Vietnam. I attempted to ask a question about JFK, and he deflected all of it. He did not want to really discuss any of that in the year 2000. I think he died shortly thereafter. I'm not sure how much longer he lived, but the fact is that McNamara's position in all of this is really strange for me to wrap my mind around, because he's part of what should have been JFK's pullout, right? He's in there. I mean, obviously he's the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy too. So that's a whole different policy with Johnson. What happened for him to then be part of that from 1963, because the end of 63, but really 1964, when the Johnson administration gets its feet on the ground after the morning JFK is killed, right? He kind of gets behind the escalation. He's part of it. He's definitely there. He doesn't seem to be resisting it. So I've never been able to wrap my mind around exactly what McNamara's position was here, because he seemed to be part of a pullout, then he seems to be part of an escalation, then it seems like you said, viewing the fog of war, you would think he seemed to be resistant to continuing to escalate the war, and he is out. So I have a hard time understanding what McNamara's position was, or if he just simply was doing the bidding of his boss, no matter who his boss was, up to a point. But then that doesn't explain his departure from the administration at all. It's a bit confusing. And even reading what he's written about it, quite frankly, I don't think that there's been a good deal of clarity made about this circumstance, Mike. Maybe you could enlighten me differently, but it seems rather confusing. Am I wrong, or is there something I missed?
No, I think you're correct. That his statements are contradictory, and it is confusing.
Right. I mean, it almost seems like opposing positions in a lot of places here would have to be taken in order for him to continue to do the job as the Secretary of Defense.
I think to tell you the story of him quitting, or what his breakdown really was.
Sure.
And then I'll try to give a more direct answer.
Sure.
But okay. One thing about the war is the bombing didn't work.
Right.
And so there's a controversy. People that claim we could have won the war, they make the argument that we just didn't bomb enough, that there was restrictive bombing, and if we would have had unrestricted bombing, then we could have won. Well, there's several Air Force histories, and I got them, that show that all the bombing on the Ho Chi Minh Trail didn't stop the supplies coming down.
Right.
And the men coming down. And the real reason why is because it didn't take much supplies. It was only like the equivalent of a tractor trailer coming down there every day that supplied their entire effort. So we couldn't, they could just walk it down there, basically. So that's why the bombing was essentially futile. And like I said, there's Air Force histories that say this. So the whole argument that we didn't bomb enough is
it's ludicrous.
It's nonsense.
Yeah.
So, but in 1967, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who the chairman was General Wheeler at the time, they were pushing for more bombing, and McNamara and Lyndon Johnson were concerned that and they were always concerned about this, just as Kennedy was, that if the war was escalated to a point by the United States, that the Chinese would come in, and then it would turn worse.
It'd be like a repeat of what happened with Korea, where we get pushed back or out. And see, that's the interesting thing about this Ho Chi Minh Trail concept, because they were basically just filling in the holes again with shovels, and things could continue on. It didn't take much to continue to have that trail running, number one. Number two,
it wasn't, the reason why it wasn't like one road, it was It was hundreds of trails, It was just like woods.
Right.
It's like endless trails.
But there were trails alongside of trails and so on and so
Yeah.
forth, and all they had to do was reconnect them somehow. If the hole was too big in the ground, then they could just redirect it around
there's a great story where the intelligences or bombers, the Air Force, they're taking pictures of the damage they do in this bombing, and they notice that there's this big bridge that the Vietnamese are sending trucks across, and they try to bomb it, and that it doesn't blow up. It's some super concrete bridge, and they make this a high priority target. They try to bomb it again, and it doesn't blow up, and then they actually lose some airplanes, because now the Vietnamese are defending it with their anti-aircraft guns. So they actually get some sort of super bomb and explode it, and they finally destroy the bridge and expect, they want to take pictures of it to show the victory. So they take some more reconnaissance pictures, and Lord behold, what happens? The Vietnamese are now just crossing in a little gully, just a few yards downstream. It's like the bridge didn't even matter.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing is that it's like, well, it's all right. We can go this way then. It's a little harder, but we'll do it. That was one thing. The other thing is that simultaneously, the search and destroy missions were all successful on the ground. Basically, take this hill, they did. Take this staging area, they did. And it didn't matter because they just kept regrouping. Take this village, okay. They would regroup in another place, and they kept falling back and regrouping. And it was just like, it was a futile effort. They would take ground. And like I described in the opening there, of this conversation, they would then surrender that ground because they couldn't hold it. The U.S., the Marines and stuff, especially those guys, which is an interesting story from the Tet Offensive. At one point, and to give you an idea of how caught off guard some of our forces were during the Tet Offensive, there are literally stories where Marines attempting to defend Moreland's headquarters, right? They ran out of ammunition and went hand to hand with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. And I'm not talking about a handful of guys. I'm talking about all of them. It's a messy thing that went on here. But I'm just saying, the idea that this war was like, well, we could have won if they had let us bomb, that's false. They could have won if we could have won if they let us win. Our guys were going and doing their jobs according to what they were supposed to be doing. And the casualty count, again, as I stated before, if you take a look at the ratio, it's something like 10-1. And if I'm a little bit off, let's just say it's 8-1. Okay? How about that? We'll be kind. They were killing more of the enemy than they were losing. They were taking all the ground they were instructed to take. They were bombing everything they were supposed to bomb. And it didn't matter. Because this wasn't the type of war where you take a piece of property, keep it, and keep moving. And the fact is that I just don't believe anybody in the military was fully prepared to reckon with that kind of conflict. And I think, again, that the story is so well told in 67 and 68 where there are 500,000 troops there, right? And still they could not, even killing 10-1, 8-1, whatever you want to call it, of the enemy. They could not take.
Well, it's so bad that, okay, what's new to me, that I didn't know, and is barely touched on, is, so, as I said, the bombing wasn't working, and McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1967 wanted to increase the bombing, and him and Johnson said, okay, we're not going to increase it anymore. We're not going to bomb Hanoi and ports and stuff like that in fear that China's going to do it. And their allies and some of their allies in the media, the press, attacked Johnson and McNamara in particular, and politicians did too, in the Congress and the Senate that were hawks, for lack of a better word. And they held hearings about the bombing, and McNamara was at him, having to defend himself, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, some of them were challenging him. So what the impact of that was, he lost, and this was happening in the fall of 1967, by going into a conflict with the military in these hearings, he lost his political cachet. McNamara did.
Right.
And that's ultimately what pushed him out of being Secretary of Defense, not him becoming a peacenik, but not wanting to escalate the bombing and when the Joint Chiefs of Staff did, and this became all public. So I say that because in 1968, when everything blew up in January, and then Quezon became under siege, General Westmoreland and General Wheeler, Westmoreland was the commanding general in Vietnam,
right.
Wheeler, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Westmoreland wanted more troops, and McNamara and LBJ already said that's the limit. You know, they set a limit in 1967, and now he's saying, I need more troops or I'm going to be overrun. So these, there's people out there that say, well, we won the Tet Offensive, and that's a sign, that we could have won too. Well, by the end of the year we won, not in January. No. They were scared. The U.S. military was scared of being overrun. Quezon was under siege. General Westmoreland asked for permission to use nuclear weapons if necessary to defend Quezon. Right. That's something that's, you can find articles about that. And I think you've mentioned it, or we talked about it maybe at some point. But what is new to me is when you connect all these things together. In January, McNamara started to have a breakdown, not because he was worried, it became a peacenik, so to speak, but he was worried that the war itself was now going to get out of control, right. That we were going to lose, that in order to not lose, we were going to have to escalate in a way in which it would get out of control, in which we would have to do more bombing or drop an atomic bomb, or the military, the confrontation could lead that way, and he wouldn't be able to stop it because he had lost really his political influence in Congress and with the military itself. And the final meeting he has as Secretary of Defense, I saw quotes before in which he there's different account. There's an earlier account of it I saw in which he cursed. Not cursed. He might have, but he said bombing was futile to Johnson's National Security Advisor Walter Rostow, who had always been a huge proponent of bombing. Even when Kennedy was president, he was an assistant national security guy then, and he had been the leading hawk in the civilian hawk in the White House. When Johnson was president, he took George Bundy's place, and he was always supporting the Joint Chiefs of Staff for more bombing.
Right.
And at this final meeting, McNamara, starts crying and says it's all futile and your bombing is futile, and yells or says something to Walt Rostow. That's the account I had heard in the books.
Right.
Well, there's more to it. Clark Clifford was at the meeting, and another person whose mind escapes me, but they have given their own account in the past, or at least it's become public.
Right.
In the past year, it's become public, and they say that McNamara told Clark Clifford, who's going to succeed him, that you've got to get control of the war. It's getting out of control. And that's basically what the breakdown was about. Now, I believe that McNamara, your question about what's McNamara's game or what the hell was his motivation, I don't think he simply obeys who the president is. He did that for Kennedy. I don't doubt that. He certainly did his best to implement Kennedy's policies.
Yes, he did.
But and he actually did try to, there's some tapes you can see. Okay, when Kennedy's left office, the policy was to train the South Vietnamese army and leave when that training was complete, whether or not we win the war or not. That was the policy.
Right.
John Newman's book proves that, but you can go and listen to his last press conference about Vietnam. He states that. And then when Johnson is president, there's a conversation played in that Fog of War movie where McNamara says that's the policy. However, McNamara also pressured, and I believe, not believe, both him and McGeorge Bundy did pressure Johnson to escalate the war, and Johnson drug his feet. A lot of people say, well, he was just doing that because he wanted to wait till after the election. But after the election, he continued to do that until about February 1965. So I'll have to write this out and put the evidence in a book to prove this, because a lot of people listening won't believe it, because a lot of people think Johnson was the warmonger or something. But I think McNamara's role is actually consistent, or his motivation is consistent from when Kennedy was president to the day he left. And I think what he was trying to do was control the military from not stopping them from going to wars, but making it so the war wouldn't lead to nuclear war. And I think that's what he was doing in Vietnam the whole time.
See, here's something that is very important that is missed and is never brought up in any of these conversations. Again, I really look forward to you writing your third volume, I guess, even though you're working on volume 1, because here we go. Westmoreland wanted to use the nuclear weapons. That escalation in some people's calculus would have guaranteed that the Chinese entered the conflict.
And they had nuclear weapons by 1965, so what would have happened?
Well, that's the thing, is if the Chinese enter the conflict because it's on their back door, and then they launch nuclear weapons into the circumstance in defense of the North Vietnamese. You want to talk about something that'll get out of control real quick. So I'm very sure that nobody wanted to actually hand that over to Westmoreland. Tactically on the ground, it might have made sense to him somehow, but it would have made terrible sense from a global view, if you will, of the circumstances. It would have caused. I
completely believe, and it was never put in writing, but there was always an implicit understanding between the U.S., China, and Vietnam, and both sides of Vietnam, of what the limits of escalation could be over time.
Yeah, it seemed like that, like you said. But then again, you also have the Soviet Union still sitting there also watching this conflict, right? There's a lot that could have gotten in play and out of hand, and this could have spread to various other countries that surrounded Vietnam very easily. There's only a small border with Laos, really, considerably speaking. But it wouldn't have been that crazy for Laos or Cambodia to now become directly involved in some sort of, Asian war that would have spread all over the continent. Especially with the escalation of nuclear weapons, you're talking about a mess that quite frankly, I would have been looking to de-escalate
when Kennedy was killed, for the 3 months after he was killed, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were giving proposals to McNamara to escalate the war and do mass bombing. And their argument was, look, they gave the same argument to Kennedy at the start with Laos and over and over again several times. But they were making war plans to do all this by 1964 in the first couple months with guess who? Victor Krulak in charge of the war plan.
Okay, well,
which is kind of funny. But anyway, their argument was that look, they didn't want to send all these forces over there. They wanted to do mass bombing. And their argument was, well, if China intervenes, we don't think they will because we have nuclear superiority. They don't have a nuclear bomb. We do. So we kind of have free reign to bomb as much as we want. That's what they believed. Now, they also argued that if China came in, we would just use a nuclear bomb on them. And, I don't know. I don't think they've ever, claimed that they would bomb the whole country or something, but I've seen it where they said they would bomb, at least one city. So, I believe that the Kennedy assassination, created that. I mean, it's a whole nother show, but I think there was some sort of crisis that was surrounding it. Johnson was telling people there was in order to form the Warren Commission. He was telling Earl Warren and others that if we don't cover up the assassination, we'll have to go to war in Cuba. And we don't want to do that. Well, he wrote a memo to the Joint Chiefs of Staff a week or two after the assassination telling them that our sole focus is now going to be Vietnam, saying not Cuba, Vietnam, So I think that the assassination created some sort of crisis within the government or the executive branch that made Johnson or pressured him even more or pressured him into making a war somewhere. And he chose to escalate or start to in Vietnam instead of Cuba.
Well, it's certainly a different look at this history than I've had before, because I've always considered Johnson to be one of the main war hawks here in the equation. So, the fact that you're saying that he was really dragging his feet, I don't know. I've never seen the evidence of that. So I want to see this kind of laid out, and you're the kind of guy who can do this. So it'll be interesting to see. I've never seen it. I've always seen it like assumed by people. Johnson was just, unluckily inheriting what Kennedy started kind of thing, which I also don't believe is correct under any circumstance, even with what you're saying regarding him dragging his feet or whatever. But it's a very strange time. And I think that there's some missing element here that we don't necessarily know publicly just yet, but it's got to be discovered in order to make this a more coherent story. Now, it's funny, I didn't intend to go through 50 minutes with Mike on the Vietnam War, but we did. And I think this is an interesting discussion, certainly historically relevant, and one of those things that, I'm sorry, was on my mind one day after Veterans Day.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, I was working on this. I got a book called Vietnam Reconsidered. It's written by a veteran, and I saw an advertisement for it.
Okay.
And what I was actually going to talk about it on the show, but what I was going to tell you was what this guy does in the beginning of the book is talk about the growing up as a teenager, basically in the 50s and 60s, and he talks how rock music of the time had this huge cultural impact on him and everyone else, and just being young and everything changing. And he says that Kennedy represented that to him when Kennedy was president. Someone younger and reflecting sort of just, a changing times. Right. And then when Kennedy died, a month or two later, the Beatles were on American Bandstand for the first time.
Right.
And he claims that the thing he thought about Kennedy got transformed even more by his generation onto the Beatles and all the other singers.
Well, a lot of people have talked about that culturally, quite frankly, it was like the enthusiasm, the exuberance that came from the Kennedy administration, that came from a cultural time where seemingly like young people were going to be in charge and there were going to be new ideas, new thoughts, stuff like the Peace Corps and all this kind of stuff being introduced into the psychology of America. It was kind of a revolutionary and interesting time. And then when he was gone, there are many people that think the powers that be said, well, we got to try and keep this going, and they introduced the Beatles to America at that time. It's an interesting thought, and I feel like there is something to it. When the vacuum is created, culturally, politically, psychologically, spiritually, doesn't matter. Something usually emerges to fill it, whether it does it in exactly the same way or not, I don't know. Now, I want to hold your hand doesn't exactly replace, how about we talk about peace for real? Although John Lennon did graduate into that later after his many years as a successful pop artist, didn't he? So it's kind of fascinating to think about the cultural shift, and I think it is a significant time culturally, especially post-Kennedy assassination. Medgar Evers had been killed earlier in 1963, but the decapitation of basically progressive thought, I mean, all that energy had to go somewhere, and if it didn't fall into just depressive pits, it had to go somewhere, and I think that might have been part of what fueled the significant focus on rock music and its cultural significance, culminating in Woodstock and things like this. So I think there's something to be said about the trajectory, if you will, of American culture and the zeitgeist of the 1960s having been written pretty much in the blood of of John F. Kennedy. Because that was the first big piece to fall in public and to be fell by the confusing and combative times that we were about to enter into. And, of course, the protests and the things that would emerge, the anti-war sentiment, all of this plays a role in what became American culture for, well, the next couple decades and its effect. The war, the Kennedy assassination, the King assassination, the other Kennedy assassination, all of the other deaths and the behavior of the police and the civil rights struggles that all clashed at exactly this time. You cannot say that it wasn't the stew that then fed the following decades and what we ended up with later. It definitely influenced the trajectory. So, interesting point to be made by somebody who went there. Interesting point to be made about the Kennedy assassination for sure, and a lot of interesting talk here about the Vietnam War. Again, I really look forward to what your third volume will be regarding the Vietnam War. You're still working on your first. But aside from that, Michael, what about podcasts? Have you put up any new ones since we last spoke?
No, not because I went out of town last week, but I'll have a couple by next week, next time we talk.
You got anything that you want to let people know is coming out on the Wall Street Window podcast?
Well, just stay tuned. I'm trying to ring up a couple guests, so I'm trying to get Stu Wexler actually to talk about. Maybe I heard you talk with him, but his book about America's Secret Jihad.
Yes,
I want to talk with him about that. So.
That is a very interesting discussion. I did have Stu on, I think about a month and a half ago, and it was an enlightening conversation. Of course, Stu has been a co-author with Larry Hancock on The Awful Grace of God, I think a couple other books. But he's written about the King assassination, he's written about the Kennedy assassination, and in this case he's writing about the white power and the underground, if you will, of the sort of the American jihadi and things like this. There's a lot to that book. And have you read it, by the way?
Just some of it. I've got it right in my hand right here, but I haven't read the whole thing. Definitely,
I look forward to that, and of course, probably you'll have something else coming up of historical relevance and all that. Before we run completely out of time, I am keeping track of your various financial emails and things like that. I really wish you'd stop calling cannabis stocks dope stocks, but it's okay. That's one of the things you get when you sign up for the emails over at wallstreetwindow.com. You get updates on, well, a whole bunch of globally, politically motivated things and such, but you also get a look at the financial markets. Is there anything like in 2 minutes that we need to keep our eye on that's coming up in the financial markets, Wall Street, whatever? We know about the quantitative easing and the changing that's going on with the Federal Reserve as of late, but the markets seem to have ricocheted and bounced and not really fallen yet. I'm wondering when that's coming, but hey, there's always the impeachment hearing starting tomorrow, and God knows what'll happen next. So anything that we need to know there or keep our eyes on?
Well, the biggest thing that's happened recently is the Fed, they lowered rates 3 times in the past couple of months, and then said they're going to pause on that. But they're not going to they don't see any rate hikes coming. So what that suggests is that they're kind of on hold probably till the middle of next year, and if the stock market falls 5% or there's any sign of an more economic slowdown, then they'll start lowering rates again. And with the stock market typically holds up into the end of a year, so I'm not expecting it to do anything soon, but next year I would, any little pullback, they'll be lowering rates. And to me, that means is buy gold and silver now, because they went up a lot, and then around Labor Day it started to pull back. Gold fell from like $1,550 to $1,450. So I think now's the time to buy those, because they'll go up like crazy when they start lowering rates again.
Right. Well, that's a good thing to keep track of. Of course, I appreciate you doing this with me, Mike Swanson, almost every Tuesday, except when he's out of town or something. He's here, and we go through a variety of topics. Tonight, almost exclusively, we talked about Vietnam. I think this is relatively interesting. Now, in the next hour, I'm going to be talking to Pierce Redmond about the current wars. But, that's the way it goes. So, Mike, you're going to be with us next week, right?
Oh, yeah, I'll be here.
Excellent. And obviously, if you feel like taking this and utilizing it for one of those Wall Street Window podcasts, an interesting discussion on Vietnam that you didn't have to conduct yourself, that just kind of came together organically, go right ahead if you think it was good. If not, sorry to have wasted your time, my friend.
I'll do that. No, I'll be glad to do that. I'll probably do thank you.
200th episode of Porkins Policy Radio, but you will be back week after next here on the Ochelli Effect. Am I right?
Yes, indeed.
So, in the meantime, always go over to PorkinsPolicyReview.com. There is where you can keep track of what Pierce is doing outside of when I'm producing them. And obviously, we'll be hearing from you more in the future. Sorry we ran out of time there, because believe me, I think we could have done 2 hours on this particular topic. But meanwhile, guys, Tuesday's show is over. Thanks to Mike Swanson for being here in the first hour. And remember, no matter who you are, where you are, I am merely Ochelli. All of you are indeed the effect. Thank you, and